Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, and thank you so much for being here tonight. I know you came to listen to me. Of course, this is a wonderful venue. It is impressive. And I would say that everyone, including Michael Marmot, who is certainly traveling the world all the time, every person I was saying must be impressed by the beauty of the place and also by the wealth in terms of richness of the agenda of this festival. Certainly, those working in the health sector must be incredibly impressed by the fact that it was possible to put together an agenda that entails that different perspectives are considered when addressing health and economy. And you see, in the health sector, we do not have a festival of this sort. Perhaps it is so that nobody of us would be able to cover and grasp all the aspects that pertain to health. So, as I said, a wonderful festival, a precious opportunity, a valuable opportunity. And it was a discovery for me as well, because I met Giuseppe Laterza, and this proves that there are also nice publishers, which is a new thing for me. I'm here with Sir Michael Marmot. I'm sure that you all know what Sir Michael has been doing over the years. And I also checked Wikipedia, you see, and actually the article in Wikipedia is well done. And I'm sure that everybody has read the same source. I don't know what to add, but anyway, I would say that Sir Michael is a sort of ambassador of the health determinants, social determinants, and we have, of course, both aspects of health and disease. And this is indeed one of the aspects that are key and that have to be addressed when addressing epidemiology, because, of course, determinants are not easy at all. They are complex things. This might sound something which is not close to the daily life of physicians, of clinicians, but it is not so. Should I teach a young student of medicine something about epidemiology, I would resort to an example which often Michael Marmot quotes, which explains that nothing is more frustrating for a physician than managing to cure a person and give this person back to the same environment that caused the disease. So this is basically the idea, the concept, the evidence, actually, that should serve as a bridge between clinical practice and assistance and those studying health policies. Michael Marmot, oftentimes, by those who perhaps dislike his work, is judged as a person who underlines excessively the political aspects of the job of being a doctor, of being a physician, and he answers that it is not like that. And yet, as a matter of fact, there is something which is profoundly political in the engagement aspect of citizens in demanding for more equity and fairness in the health sector and in health conditions. So you see, we live in a world where injustice sometimes is not considered with the seriousness it deserves. Some days ago, I purchased a number of books about decision-making, about daily decision-making, actually. And it happened to me that I found a book by an American, Italo-American actually, writer, author, who is very well known, and she published a book that I disliked. She writes in the beginning of the book, and I don't want to mention names, that the goal of our actions in order to live better must be that of becoming tied to injustice, which is exactly the opposite of what Michael Marmot says. I'm about to conclude my introduction. I will only add that we have here a person of outstanding modernity. Suffices to know that I feel so lucky that I had the fortune of reading The Health Gap, and this lucky event happened for me because I found a tweet by Michael Marmot where he wrote, "Finally, I finished writing my book." And luckily, publisher La Terza is not here and doesn't hear me say that today this mirrors what happens in the publishing sector. But happily, short after that, we could have the book. Michael Marmot is very clear, is crystal clear, very strict as well, and I mean rigorous in his work. And I was impressed by an interview that he made with a young Canadian physician, published in a very beautiful journal, where he summarized into 4 points what I think the health of the future should be. Michael Marmot said that the 4 pillars of the 4 legs of the table of health should be evidence, passion, urgency, and stories. You might know how popular storytelling is. I'm talking about narrative medicine. I'm talking, of course, about the health sector and medicine. Well, I must say that Michael Marmot provides a wonderful combination of the stories of people and evidence in health. So, you see, we have a singer in Italy who is called Peppino Di Capri, and back in 1965 he happened to sing before the Beatles. So I'm like Peppino Di Capri here, and I give the floor to the Beatles, to Michael Marmot.
Thank you for that introduction. I heard a lot of nice words, but I heard one thing that was really shocking. He said people who don't like Michael Marmot's work. I'm shocked. Didn't realize it was true, but there we are. As you quoted, the first lines of my book, The Health Gap, was what good does it do to treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? When people talk about health, commonly what they mean is health care. Healthcare is very important. When we get sick, we need access to high-quality healthcare. But it's not lack of healthcare that leads to ill health in the first place. No more than is headache caused by aspirin deficiency. If you've got a headache, it's quite good to take an aspirin. But that wasn't the cause of the headache. So we need to distinguish between the causes of ill health and health inequalities and the treatment that we need. When I arrived here yesterday, I saw the signs and I thought, that looks a bit familiar. La salute diseguale. I've seen that before somewhere. Yeah, my book. We had a discussion as to which of us would mention I will be signing copies of my book later at the bookshop. I was in Miami recently, a couple of weeks ago, and just before I got there, you may have read that a teenager, a black teenager, was shot by a white policeman for the crime of leaving a party in a motor car. And he was murdered by a white policeman. In my book, I write about the US city of Baltimore, Maryland. And I was talking about the health gap in the US, and the month before, Baltimore had erupted in civil unrest. The precipitant of the civil unrest was the killing of a black man in police custody, or should I say, one more killing of a black man by the police. That was the precipitant, but the underlying cause was inequality. Because when I say Baltimore erupted, I'm being slightly inaccurate. It was not the whole of Baltimore. It was the deprived inner city part, Upton Druid. And I'd been writing about Baltimore. In the worst off part of Baltimore, where the riots happened, life expectancy for men was 63. And in Roland Park, leafy Roland Park, 83. I was at a meeting at Johns Hopkins University, which is in Baltimore, and a couple of young doctors kidnapped me and said, "You cannot sit here in this university and not see Baltimore." So they took me, and we started in Roland Park, beautiful leafy green Roland Park, where the Johns Hopkins professors live. And if you live in Roland Park, life expectancy 83 for men, and you want to see what is it like to live somewhere where the life expectancy is 63, you could get on a plane and fly to Ethiopia. Alternatively, you could travel a few kilometers across town to where it's 63 in Roland Park. And when they took me to Roland Park, there are some streets where every second house has a diagonal red cross on the door. That dwelling has been condemned as unfit for human habitation. If there's an emergency, the emergency services won't go in there, the fire and police. Can you imagine what it's like in the richest country in the world, bar Luxembourg, the richest with its ill-gotten gains, but we'll leave that out. Can you imagine what it's like to live in the richest country of the world, where on a street where every second house is condemned as unfit for human habitation? And so I talk about LaShawn growing up in Upton Druid. Half the families are single-parent families. The median household income was $17,000. I'd like you to remember that figure of $17,000. The kids do poorly in school. They do badly in reading tests, a high rate of truancy. They drop out. 90% did not go on to college. Look at this. Each year, A third of young people aged 10 to 17 are arrested for juvenile disorder. A third each year. The chance of getting to 18 without having been arrested is really very small. In theory, the slate is wiped clean at 18. You go for a job and they ask, have you ever been in trouble with the police? You could lie, which is not a very good qualification. Actually, it could get you to the White House, couldn't it, lying? But for normal people, lying is not a good qualification for a job. It's terrible thinking what this man is doing to the world that we inhabit, but I divert. So being arrested is catastrophic for your future life. And over that 5-year period, there were 100 non-fatal shootings for every 10,000 residents and nearly 40 homicides. When I was in Miami recently and I was giving the commencement address to the graduating class, and I said, in Glasgow, we have a lot of violence. People get beaten up, we have crime, but we have almost no killings because we have no guns. I thought I might get lynched talking about how bad guns are. And in Roland Park, 93% two-parent families, median household income, $90,000, not $17,000. The kids do well in school, they don't drop out. 75% complete college, as distinct from 90% not going on to college. Juvenile arrests, not 1 in 3, but 1 in 50 each year. No non-fatal shootings and 4 homicides, 1/10 the homicide rate. It's easy to see why health might be bad in Upton Druid. But 2 caveats. One, a median household income of $17,000 on a global scale is fantastically rich. Costa Rica, where male life expectancy is about 76, 13 years longer, has a median income per person, adjusting for purchasing power, of $13,000. So the poor people of Baltimore are really rich on a global scale, but they have very poor health. And the second is that inequalities in health are not confined to poor health for the poor. These are still US figures. By years of education, for white women, black women, white men and black men, the more years of education, the longer the life expectancy. It is a gradient. And commonly I get asked, why should I care? I'm not poor. So why should I care? I don't really care about the poor. So it's a very bad problem, but it's not my problem. And my response is the gradient is your problem. Because everybody below the top has worse health than those at the very top. And in the US, it's affecting everybody. Anne Case and Angus Deaton published this paper in 2015. Angus Deaton said that when he won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2015, there was quite a lot of interest from the press. And when they published this paper, there was 10 times the interest in the press. It's looking at mortality of 45 to 54-year-olds. And what you can see is it's declining from 1990 to 2012. It's declining in France, Germany, UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden, all of those countries. Big differences between France and Sweden, but all of those countries it's declining, as it is in US Hispanics. But In US non-Hispanic whites, it's going up. The fewer the years of education, the steeper the rise. So the gradient is getting steeper, but even for people with more years of education, it was not declining. And what are the causes? There's a lot of debate in the US about health care, but this is not a health care issue. Number one, poisonings due to drugs and alcohol. Number two, suicide. Number three, alcoholic liver disease. And then, of course, there's violent deaths. Poisonings was number one, with drugs and alcohol. As long as black people in the US were using crack cocaine, that was seen as a criminal issue. When white people are misusing opioids, that's seen as a medical issue. Fundamental racism, which we can't ignore, but that's not all there is. The gradient. These are data from England, figure 1 in my book, which will be available afterwards. The top graph is life expectancy, and each dot represents a small area, a neighborhood, and they're classified by level of deprivation. So as you look at it, to the right are the most affluent neighborhoods, and to the left are the most deprived. And what you can see is people near the top have shorter life expectancy than those at the top. Those in the middle, shorter life expectancy than those near the top, all the way from top to bottom. The bottom graph is disability-free life expectancy, and the gradient is steeper. And there are two lines there. The dotted line are figures for 1999 to 2003, and the solid line is 10 years later. And what you can see is health has improved for everybody, but the gradient hasn't changed. And I would argue that we should have two societal goals: to improve health for everybody and to reduce inequality. And in most of our European countries, we're doing pretty well on the first, of improving health for everybody, but not doing very well on the second, of reducing inequality. And the magnitude of those inequalities varies enormously. The red dots are people with primary education, and the blue triangles, those with tertiary education, looking at life expectancy for EU member states. And you can see that Sweden and Italy have among the longest life expectancy, this is for men, and a relatively shallow gradient, a relatively small gap between those with primary education and those with tertiary education. When we look at Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Slovenia, much lower average and a huge gap. Another way of saying this is we do know how to get good health in Bulgaria, Romania, and those other countries because people with university education get it. The disadvantage of being in one of those Central and Eastern European countries is much bigger if you have only primary education. The reason I show this is because it shows that the gradient, the health gap, can vary. Because if it was always the same everywhere, well, you'd say, what can we do about it? But this way, the evidence shows there's a great deal we can do. I don't want us to forget mental illness, important part of the story. Data from England, people of lower social class have higher levels of mental illness than those of higher. True for men and for women, and there are higher rates of mental illness in women. As part of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, which I chaired, We reviewed the evidence on depression, and the expert group that we had said that the relation of low socioeconomic position to depression globally, not just UK, globally, was very convincing. Low education, very convincing. Unemployment and underemployment, very convincing. And then these others, strong evidence. Go on. So putting this together, the question is, can we do something about it? I decided I didn't only want to study the problem, although I've spent my life studying the problem. I wanted to see if we could use the best evidence to address the problem. And I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. We published our report in 2008, and we called it Closing the Gap in a Generation. And we put on the cover of our report, social injustice is killing on a grand scale. Slightly unusual for a WHO publication. Social injustice is killing on a grand scale. And we said at the heart of what we wanted to do was to achieve empowerment of individuals, of communities, and indeed of whole countries. Material, psychosocial, and political. We wanted to create the conditions for people to have control over their lives. Note, the concept of freedom is very important, but it shouldn't be hijacked by the right. Freedom is fundamental, but we have to create the conditions for people to be empowered. That young man growing up in Upton Druid in Baltimore cannot be empowered. He doesn't have freedom. He has the tragic imprint on him of his life circumstances. He doesn't have freedom. Create the conditions for him to have control over his life, then he can do what he wants. So our conceptual framework, we have the distribution of health and well-being. We look at material circumstances, social cohesion, psychosocial factors, behavior, biological factors, and the healthcare system. These are distributed unequally by education, occupation, income, gender, ethnicity, and race. And then we need to look at the socioeconomic and political context. And this is what we call the social determinants of health and health inequities. And I would argue that the mind, I almost said the gateway, is an important gateway by which social circumstances affect ill health. The impact on mental illness and well-being, but also psychosocial pathways to physical illness. That might be through behaviors, smoking, diet, and the like, and also stress pathways. I've been interested in the inequalities in health in Glasgow. And there is a Glasgow effect in Scotland of very poor health. These data compare Glasgow with Liverpool and Manchester. Similar levels of poverty. You've heard of those places because they have good football teams, but they also have a lot of poverty and inequality. Similar levels of poverty and inequality, but higher mortality in Glasgow. Look at the causes. Drug-related poisonings, alcohol, suicide, and external causes. The same as I just showed you for the US. These are psychosocially determined. And Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, who gave me those data, says the major element of premature death in Scotland is psychosocially determined. Low control, low self-efficacy and self-esteem. So in my English review, which was convened to ask how can we translate the findings of the WHO Commission to one country, England, and I was commissioned by a Labour government in Britain, hard to remember when we had a Labour government in Britain, but it was embraced by the Conservative-led coalition government. And I had 6 domains of recommendations, and I'll touch on them briefly. So the first, give every child the best start in life. We've been monitoring the quality of early child development. What this graph shows, I hope, is the proportion of children age 5 that have a good level of development for each local authority in England. Again, classified by level of deprivation. As you look at it, the most affluent are to the right. And what you see is a very clear relation. The more affluent the area, the higher the proportion of children age 5 that have a good level of development. It's a gradient. And I say this is almost like a political litmus test. People on the left say it's poverty. People on the right say it's poor parenting. And I say they're both correct. The social circumstances in which you're trying to raise your children impact your ability to be a good parent. I was looking at data from the US. There are estimated to be 1.5 million households in the United States living on $2 a day or less, cashless households. Suppose some do-gooding person like me goes, and they're all single mothers, goes to one of these households and says to this single mother, "You must read bedtime stories to your children." Her response might be, "I would, if I had a bed, let alone a book." And they scatter around the line. For a given level of deprivation, some local areas are doing better than others. And that suggests 2 strategies. Reduce deprivation, bring the level of early child development of those in the poorer neighbourhoods up towards the middle. And the other is, for a given level of deprivation, work out what is breaking the link between deprivation and poor early child development. So, looking at parenting activities, we asked in the Millennium Cohort study, we asked parents, is it important to talk to a child age 3? About 20% of parents deny that it's important to talk to a child age 3. And that follows the social gradient. We asked, is it important to cuddle a child age 3? Is there an experience in this world more rewarding than cuddling a child? More rewarding both to the cuddler and the cuddlee? About 20% of parents deny that it's important to cuddle a child age 3, and that follows the social gradient. So we looked at talking, cuddling, playing, singing, all those parenting things, and they were all less common as you go down the income quintiles. So if you look at socio-emotional difficulties of children aged 3 and age 5, there's a gradient, and about half of that gradient could be explained statistically by parenting activities. And that's what I mean by the economic and social circumstances in which parents find themselves have impact on their ability to do these good things. So, breaking the link, but we can reduce poverty. This is looking at child poverty rates, where poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. So it's a relative measure for each country. Before and after taxes and transfers. Compare Latvia and Sweden. In Latvia, before taxes and transfers, child poverty was 35%. In Sweden, it was 32%. After taxes and transfers, child poverty in Latvia was still 25%. In Sweden, it was 12%. In Sweden, they don't like child poverty, so they use the fiscal system to reduce it. I was writing a piece about the health gap, about my book, for an American publication, Scientific American, and I thought, if I put Sweden in there, you know what Americans think about Sweden, you know, it's some Marxist, Leninist hellhole. So I compared the US with Australia. I thought Australia sounds a bit like Texas, or maybe California. And the poverty measure I had was not 60%, it was less than 50% median income. Before taxes and transfers, the poverty level in the US was about 23%, that's 50% median income, and in Australia it was 29%, 23 in the US, 29. After taxes and transfers, poverty levels in the US were still 23%, and in Australia it had gone from 29% to 11%. And the editor of Scientific American said, I think you should take that out of the article. I said, why? He said, I think you're talking about redistribution, and that won't wash with an American audience. I said, I think that's why we should leave it in. He said, well, I don't get it. Let me try, he said, this is by email, let me try and see if I understand this. What you're saying is that in Australia, they tax middle-income people, middle and higher-income people, and use that money to reduce poverty. I said, yeah. He said, some countries actually do that? I said, now you're starting to understand why you have that high mortality in middle age in the US. It starts with early childhood. And you can break the link between early child poverty, deprivation, and poor early child development. Hackney is a relatively poor part of East London, and I got on my bicycle and pedalled out to Hackney before I fell off my bicycle and fractured my femur, but that's another story. And they said to me, in Hackney, we tell ourselves every day that poverty is not destiny. We can break that link. And I said, show me. Well, look at the data. In Britain, we use eligibility for free school meals, FSM, free school meals, as a poverty measure. It's a means-tested benefit. And if you look at the English data, the average, 60% of pupils in England have a good level of development age 5. Those poorer children eligible for free school meals, it's just under 45%, so the gap is just under 16%. Now look at Hackney. The poor kids are doing as well as the English average. They really did break the link. The gap is only 4%. Look at Bath and northeast Somerset. Beautiful Georgian Bath, lovely place to visit. The gap's enormous. My guess is, if you go to Bath and you say, what do you do for poor children in Bath? They say, poor children? We didn't know we had any. If you go to Hackney and say, what do you do for poor children? They've got lots of them. That's why they get out of bed in the morning, to deal with the problems of disadvantage. And you focus on the problem, you can make a difference. The other issue in early childhood is not just the lack of good development, but it's the presence of adverse things, adverse child experiences. Verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, parental separation, domestic violence, mental illness in the parents, alcohol abuse in the parents, drug use, and being in prison are all adverse child experiences. Potentially, If you could prevent adverse child experiences, and need I say they follow the gradient, the lower the social position, the more frequent are adverse child experiences, you could potentially reduce early sex by a third, unintended teen pregnancy by 38%. Look at violence perpetration, domestic violence. You could potentially reduce the perpetration of domestic violence by half by abolishing adverse child experiences. And even more chillingly, look at victimization of domestic violence. Half the victims of domestic violence were themselves subject to adverse child experiences. And in fact, domestic violence, 1 in 3 women globally has experienced domestic violence. Something like 60% of women who are murdered globally are murdered by their partner. 6% of men are murdered by their domestic partner. Domestic violence is a global issue, but preventing adverse child experiences, improving early childhood, would do a great deal. Education and lifelong learning. I'm going to try and go a bit faster. What we see, these are PISA scores, Program of International Student Assessment, not the Leaning Tower of, done by the OECD, looking at maths results at age 15 by economic and social classification, quartiles. Finland always does the best in Europe. It has a social gradient. The higher the economic and social classification, the higher the scores at age 15 on maths. The UK, our top quartile, doesn't do quite as well as the top quartile in Finland, and our bottom quartile does much worse. The gradient's steeper. Look at the US. I don't have it in for the US, really I don't, but look how steep the social gradient is. So I talked about problems in early childhood in the US. Now we've got a social gradient in school performance. We know that for probably the bottom 80% of income earners, income has really not improved much in the last 3 decades in the US. So taking a life course approach, it's not quite so mysterious why what Anne Case and Angus Deaton call an epidemic of despair might account for that rise in mortality. I've been talking at various points today about the high youth unemployment, young people unemployment in Italy, which is a calamity. And social policies make a difference. This is from David Stuckler, who I went to hear this morning, but he looked like a young woman with anyway, he wasn't here, but from David Stuckler. And what this shows is for countries, a 3% rise in unemployment is associated with a 3% rise in the suicide rate of that country, were there no expenditure on social protection. Eastern European countries spend about $37 a head on social protection, and a 3% rise in unemployment is associated with about a 2.5% rise in suicide. Western European countries, we spend on average about $150 a head, and a 3% rise in unemployment is associated with a less than 1% rise in suicide. So unemployment is bad for mental health. The idea, as some of our politicians tell us, that unemployment is a lifestyle choice is totally contradicted by the evidence. So little do people like unemployment that they kill themselves. That was on working conditions, but I want you to get out of here this evening. Ensure a healthy standard of living for all. Thomas Piketty, who somehow no one's ever heard of, and his colleagues produced these data looking at income shares in the United States. In 1928, the top 1% of income earners had 23% of total household income. And you know what happened next? The great crash of 1929. And it all came tumbling down, including the share enjoyed by the top 1%. And right through the 1950s and 1960s, when the US economy just kept growing and growing and growing and growing and growing, and the top 1% had 10% or less of total household income. Then the Reagan-Thatcher era, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, suddenly it took off again. And by 2007, the top 1% had 23% of total household income. And you remember what happened next. We had a global financial crisis. Now, I work in a university. I know that correlation is not causation, and that it's an unproved hypothesis, that the unconscionable greed of the top 1% brought the world's economy to its knees. But you have to admit it's a credible hypothesis. And that level of inequality will, of course, be damaging health. Healthy and sustainable places and communities, and strengthen the role and impact of prevention. I want to take a few minutes to finish because there's a contradiction. I said at the beginning, what good does it do to treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? Health inequalities primarily is not a medical care issue. And then, for some strange reason, I spent a year as president of the World Medical Association. So all these doctors I was dealing with. So I pursued the hypothesis that I could get doctors interested in health. I know that seems a bit unlikely, but I thought it was worth trying. And my two messages in a world of post-fact politics was evidence-based policy presented in a spirit of social justice. Remember, we said on the cover of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, social injustice is killing on a grand scale. I'm currently chairing a commission on equity and health inequalities in the Americas that was set up by the Pan American Health Organization. And we were having a meeting in Washington, D.C., and I found myself walking in the mall. For non-Americans, the mall is that area of Washington that was sparsely populated during Donald Trump's inaugural. And I was in the Martin Luther King area, and Martin Luther King said, I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love. And I thought, unarmed truth, that's like evidence-based policy. Unconditional love, spirit of social justice. Dr. King said it better than I did, but I think we were saying the same thing. That unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. We are in a very dark place politically. But I believe, with Martin Luther King, that right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. So the mission for my presidency of WMA and for my life was health equity through action on the social determinants of health. And I laid out 5 areas that doctors and medical associations could get engaged. I want to talk a little bit about working in partnership. I was invited by the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, it's the Australian version of the BBC, the national broadcaster, to give a series of radio lectures. And the Australian Medical Association wrote to me and said, "We hear you're coming, can we help you in any way?" And I said, "I'd like to see doctors in action on the social determinants of health." They said, "Would you like to visit an Aboriginal community centre?" I said, "Love to." Because the tragedy, the shame in Australia is that Indigenous Australians, Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, have, for men, life expectancy 10.6 years shorter than the Australian average, and for women 9.4 years shorter. And they said to me, "We've spent billions of dollars trying to address this issue and nothing worked. What should we do?" This was the day I arrived in Australia. I said, "I've been here 4 hours. Give me another 24 hours and I'll give you the answer." Well, after I went to the Tharawal Aboriginal Corporation, I started to have an answer. This is run by the Indigenous community. It's a centre 50 kilometres south of Sydney. They have doctors there. The popular belly cast program. Aboriginal women, pregnant women, don't attend antenatal classes. So they get the women to take plaster casts of their pregnant torsos and then they decorate them with Aboriginal art. It's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And the women love it. So once they're in doing this, then they come postnatally and to classes and childcare and the like. So they get them in. I mean, look at this, it's gorgeous. They have legal services, a Department of Housing, Centrelink, various services, disability support. When I was there, the little children, the 2-year-olds, were just bedding down for their afternoon nap. Gorgeous little children. And I said to the woman who was looking after them, "How do you know if these children are developing normally?" And she took a pile of sheets off the shelf, one for each child, with 30 indicators of child development. I said, "Where did you get these from?" "I got them from the university." So up to the minute, looking at quality of early child development. And the older children, the Deadly Homework Club, I mean, terrific stuff. And they've got these well-evaluated programs. When I went to there's a campus there, I went to the part of the campus that deals with drug and alcohol problems. Big Aboriginal woman. And I said to her, "You must have the most difficult job in this whole centre." And she said, "No, I have the most rewarding job in this whole centre." And she took me over and showed me an Aboriginal painting on the wall and said, "The man who did that, when he came to us, he had all the problems of drugs and alcohol and domestic violence, and we helped him put his life back together. And this was his gift to us. I have the most rewarding job in this centre." Good tucker all round. They have subsidised fruit and vegetables for the community. And the older people, I don't know if you can see that, grannies against removal. There was a phase, a shameful phase in Australia, where children were being removed, Aboriginal children were being removed from their families to bring them up white, with catastrophic results. And I talked to a psychologist at the centre, and she said it's still going on because now children are being removed because of violence and drugs and the like in the family. So grannies against removal. I mentioned I did these lectures, and as part of giving the lectures, the ABC had their current affairs program, panel on inequality. And the convener said to me, he'd read my lectures, "Could you tell us what you said in your lectures about income?" So I said, what do the 48 million people who make up the population of Tanzania, the 7 million people who make up the population of Paraguay, the 2 million people who make up the population of Latvia, and the top earning 25 hedge fund managers in New York have in common? And the answer is the previous year, each of those groups had a combined income of around $25 billion. And then I said, here's a thought experiment. Suppose the hedge fund managers gave up their income for 1 year. Wouldn't hurt them. They're going to earn $1 billion each the next year. And we transferred that money to Tanzania. We double the per capita income. And suppose you didn't want to just give the cash to individual Tanzanians. Think of the clean water you could pipe to the villages, the schools you could build, the nurses you could employ. And if that's too fanciful a thought experiment, here's another, even more fanciful thought experiment. Suppose the hedge fund managers paid 1/3 of their income in tax. I know that's totally fanciful. You and I pay, but they don't pay tax. But suppose they paid 1/3 of their income in tax. You could employ 90,000 New York school teachers. Another member of the panel said to me, "You're in fantasy land, mate. You're in complete fantasy land. That's never going to happen. Global capitalism has solved the problems, and you're in fantasy land." When I went to the Tarawal Aboriginal Community Centre the next day, one of the doctors greeted me with this sign, "Welcome to fantasy land." I asked the ABC if I could change the text of my first the ending of my first lecture. They said yes. So I said, in this lecture, I have laid out systematic health inequalities within and between countries. And in the lectures that follow, I will talk about what we can do. But that will include inequities in power, money and resources. But I've been told I'm in fantasy land. Imagine, I said, when Martin Luther King rose in Washington to make his most famous speech, and he said, "I have a dream that on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down together at the table of brotherhood." Instead, he said, "I've been told I'm in fantasy land. There would have been no Civil Rights Act. So, come join me in my fantasy land and let's dream of a fairer world." Can I come back, please?
Allora, a me ascoltare ogni volta Michael Marmot mi fa un effetto strano. Now, such a pleasure, such an honor listening to Michael Marmot. And it always happened on the eve of a weekend. And I would like to go back distributing daily papers as I used to do 40, 50 years ago. Well, which daily could I be delivering these days? It's difficult because I don't have, there's very little that I could choose from these days. Anyway, I think we have like 10 or 15 minutes more time for a couple of questions from the audience, if you have any. Now, feel free to ask questions. I'm sure there's a microphone going round.
Much for your discussion. Especially your experience in England, it's very interesting regarding the inequality. But one aspect that I have seen going on in this festival is the relation between inequality and the lack of education. The correlation is extremely strong. In England, especially, I think England is a unique state in Europe where the education is in a very critical position, where a very good education is left in the hands of private sector. Now, even the Labour, even Tony Blair, started with his campaign by saying education, education, education. But in the end, I have seen that there was not a real act, not a very radical change. The situation hasn't changed after, I think, 7 years of his government. And even with today, with the Gorby, we don't see a very important stress in this sector when to break the vicious circle between education and mental health in general. It's very important, and not only the health, but the social, the achievement of a different social state. So it looks like that there was a political need to keep the status quo, because if we don't change we don't break the circle of the education left only to the very good elite of the British society, there is not the vicious circle cannot be broken.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. The situation in Britain is that approximately 7% of children are educated in the private sector, and of entrants to Oxford and Cambridge, approximately 50% are educated in the private sector. You don't have to be a very good statistician to know 7% in the general population, 50% in Oxbridge. This is a glaring inequality. And it's a reasonable assumption that there are a lot of children who are not educated privately, who have the potential to do just as well. But they're not living up to their potential because of the education they're getting. Now, what we see, if you look at deciles of deprivation of areas, the metric we use in England is the percent of children who, at their national exams, age 15, get 5 GCSEs, they're called, at C or above. C, B, A, or A star. These are national exams. What we see in the most deprived decile, it's about 30% of children, only 30%, get as many as 5 Cs. In the top decile, it's about 70%, and it's a gradient. You mentioned Tony Blair. What his government did was to increase the funding for education, reduce class size, and we did see educational standards rise. Every year there's a big discussion about is it a real rise or is it an artifact, because the marking got easier. But standards rose. But the gradient didn't change. The inequalities didn't change. And I think they didn't change because one of the big predictors of educational performance is readiness for school, is early child development. And those inequalities in early child development were very stubborn. We didn't do nearly enough to change that. So these two issues, the relatively small percent of youngsters who are educated privately, but they have a disproportionate impact. Not only do they go to Oxford and Cambridge, they're in the British Olympic team. There are more Olympic athletes than the 7%. I've forgotten the figure, I think it's about 20 or 25% of Olympic athletes were educated privately. So success, academically, sportingly, theatre, our actors overwhelmingly went to private school. So that's tiny 7% having a disproportionate impact. So I think we need both to deal with the 7% and with the gradient. And we haven't done it.
Good evening. I'd like to...
Where? Thank you.
Yeah, good evening. I think what you said this evening is really great because it brings back the necessity of having a purpose in economic activity. So you brought back also the principles of the social values. But what I personally think, and I'd like to have your advice, I'd like to know what you think about it, is that there's a great problem because when we go back from our world of fantasy and we come back in the world we live in, work, that is an element that you showed as fundamental for the creation of conditions to permit to every individual to choose how to live his own life. When you go to talk about work, we see that today work is not oriented by purposes of social equality or even quality of life of every individual, but to short-term profitability. Finance, you were talking about hedge fund before. Finance, the way of working in finance has taken already the way to work in every area of our life. So I think we should also resolve this problem. So how can we put together work for short-term profitability in terms of pure monetary profit, and on the other side, the creation of social values that put together also the community through work?
Thank you. I'll embarrass that young man because I did a radio interview this afternoon at RAI, and I was wandering back through the streets, and suddenly 4 young men came up to me. He was one, and they said, "Are you Michael Marmot?" And I said, "Yes." They said, "Could we buy you a cup of coffee? We're high school students, and we've driven here from Florence because we wanted to come to this festival." And this young man said, "And I've read a couple of chapters of your book." So it was a privilege. When I saw some of my colleagues, they said, "Why are you smiling?" So I told them about this experience. Work is absolutely fundamental. I could have shown you figures that I have, but too many things to talk about, that in Britain now, more than half, the people below the minimum income threshold in poverty are in households where at least one adult is working. People are in poverty not because they're lazy and they don't want to work. They're in poverty because they're lowly paid. So the first thing we want work to do is to get people out of poverty, to give them enough money to be able to lead a dignified life. And by the way, I meant to say let me divert for a moment, when I said after I'd been to the Tharawal Community Centre, I came back to the people who said to me, we've spent billions trying to reduce the health gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and it hasn't worked. Why not? And I then said, because for 200 years you've systematically deprived the people of their dignity and their self-esteem and the possibility to lead meaningful lives. And then you ask, why doesn't simply spending money solve the problem? You do have to spend money on good services, on good schools, on good communities, but you've got to find a way to address this lack of dignity. And that relates to your question about work. Work is important to earn money, but it's also a way of having dignity, having a role in society, knowing it's meaningful. And the gig economy doesn't do that. And to the extent that we're moving to short-term, part-time work in the gig economy, it's a fundamental threat to self-esteem, to dignity, and potentially to health and health equity.
Hi Michael.
Now, can I please ask you to ask very short questions, please, very short questions.
Great presentation and a great summary. Now, I'd like to link to a comment made by Luca when he said, I'd like to go out and sell a newspaper that I was selling 50 years ago, but I would not know which one. Just to say, we grew up, our generation, in an idea that was simplified. There were the good and the bad. No, the bad were responsible for all what's wrong in the society, and the good were us. Simple. Now, we are in a situation where this is not so black and white. Yeah. And even if we look at what should be the good in the society, you don't always see, that understanding of social problems, the component of generosity to help to make the transfer, social transfer, to equalize conditions. Now, we see what the situation is in UK, we see Italy, we see that obviously there are differences. Now, how we would address now, in your opinion, to convince, not the bad, because these are the bad, as in Martin Luther King's story, but the good who are less committed to be good.
Yeah. That's, by the way, my fellow Englishman, Elio Ruboli. I think we're doing a terrible job of engaging the general public more widely in these issues. I think we've not done a good job. And it's great that a publisher is interested, a Festival of Economics is interested, but this is hardly the general public. This is interested, wonderful people. And it's great if I can convince you. But we need to do a broader set of issues. I'm an optimist, so when I see everything's terrible, I can see a glimmer of light and say it's going to get better. Look at what's going on in Britain at the moment, which is terrible post-Brexit. That terrible politics. It's ghastly. I think there's signs that we're moving back towards understanding a set of values. What's happened during this current election campaign? A deeply, deeply, deeply unpopular leader of the Labour Party who had zero chance of being elected Prime Minister says, we're going to spend more on the National Health Service. We're going to spend more on education. We're going to spend more on free childcare. We're going to employ more police. We're going to break the freeze in public sector pay. And people said, hey, that's pretty good. We don't like that guy with the beard. He's ghastly. We don't want him to be our Prime Minister. But we quite like the offer that's being made. And I think this pendulum from total selfishness. I mean, how can, God, I'm obsessed by this orange nightmare in the White House. I mean, this is the apotheosis of selfishness. This is selfishness in pure culture. His two guys, what are their names? HR and the other one, the national security. They wrote a piece and they said, forget the world community. This is about a race to see who comes out on top. They're explaining why, in his ignorance, he blamed Germany for their trade policies. He didn't apparently understand that Germany is part of the European Union, and Germany doesn't have trade policies. The European Union has trade policies. But he's too ignorant to understand that. But it was privileging selfishness. I think selfishness has gone so far that we're now starting to see the pendulum swinging back. Amartya Sen, who I could see his photo outside, I had dinner with him in Miami. He said he supported Bernie Sanders. He supported Bernie. He said his wife supported Hillary, but Amartya supported Bernie. I think we're seeing the pendulum swinging back. And it relates to the question that young man asked me, that the limits of selfishness and self-interest are becoming all too apparent. Now, you remember what I said, evidence-based policy presented in a spirit of social justice. So we need the evidence of what we can do. I have this wonderful image of a People's March on Parliament with a banner saying, what do we need? Evidence-based policies. When do we want it? After peer review. I just can't quite see the Parliament giving in to that set of demands, but that is what we want. We want evidence-based policies after peer review, but presented in a spirit of social justice. And we will get out of this terrible place we're in.
I would like to thank wholeheartedly, from the bottom of my heart, Michael Marmot. When we started thinking about the topic for this year's festival, and Tito Boeri thought about health, we did not have a title. We thought of the topic, we did not have a title. And since I'm a publisher, I know how important titles are. And then we found your book. And I was so lucky to meet Luca FIORE. And your title, actually your book's title was perfect for this festival. And your presence here today testifies to your evidence-based quality, because your line of reasoning is based on evidence, on figures, on numbers, but it has such a strong message among the numbers. Thank you so much for bringing it to this festival.
Grazie mille a tutti e buona serata.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the evening.